Hey everybody, it's Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. For all things Vespa, check us out on the web. So essentially this is kind of like part 3 of getting this scooter to start. Showed you the basic checks, figure out when your scooter doesn't crank. That's part 1. We kind of narrowed it down to the brake light's not coming on. So part 2, I replaced the brake light switches. So now it cranks over fine, still doesn't start. In the past, I've covered how to clean out a fuel injector on a modern Vespa. You know, scooter's been sitting for a year or 2 years. Typically, you'll need to clean the injector out. If it's been sitting for much longer, it may need a fuel pump. Well, before you put an expensive part like a fuel pump and go through the hassle of dropping the fuel tank, I'll show you all the checks I'm going to do before I take action and make the choice to replace the fuel pump. You know, some techs just like throwing parts at, it's not the way you do it. You want to diagnose what your problem is, and I'm going to show you how to successfully diagnose a bad fuel pump and make sure the fuel pumps get power and everything. You know, pretty much check everything off before we get to it. And I'm going to show you some other stuff underneath this 2006 GTS 250. So if you have a GTS 250, whether it's a 2006 all the way to about 2009, it's all going to be the same components. If you're 2010 and later, which are the 300s, the components are slightly different spots. There's the same components on those scooters, they just made subtle changes to some of the stuff, especially where the fuses and relays are located, but for the most part it's all the same. So let's get right to it and kind of just go one by one what I'd check. So first of all, you want to make sure you have fuel. If it's really old fuel, I'm talking like a year or older, I would suggest siphoning this out. They have, you know, siphons with a bubble. There's the shaker siphons. You can get, all you gotta get is about 80% of the fuel out. You don't have to get the last drop. The fuel tanks are very odd shape. You know, you got the filler neck here, but the fuel tank is all the way up here and, you know, goes as far down as here. And it also wraps around part of the frame. It kind of covers the rear part of this. They're a molded plastic fuel tank. The tanks are really good design. They hold up well. They don't rust like a steel tank. There's nothing really negative to say about these plastic fuel tanks. They're actually really good. But take a little sniff, a little varnishy. It doesn't smell so good. But I know there's fuel in there. So, you know, definitely want to start with some fresh fuel. And if you're trying to troubleshoot it, probably not the best idea to go ahead and put 2 gallons. Just put like 4 liters or 1 gallon in it, so you're not filling the tank all the way up. Just otherwise you may have to siphon out if you get to that point where you need a fuel pump. So let's look underneath here and I'll show you some of the components. And I'll just show you real quick. The scooter pretty much, it turns on, it cranks, we know it detects the key. We know that the check engine light comes on, then goes right off. So those are all good signs that the fuel injection's working, and electrically, everything should be pretty good. But let's check to make sure the fuel pump's getting power. So before we even check for power, let's check for pressure. So you want to wear some safety glasses of some sort. This is inherently dangerous because you're releasing high pressure fuel potentially. I don't think there's any pressure, so I don't think we're gonna have a problem, but I got a little rag just to kind of keep the fuel from dripping everywhere. They have these plastic buttons on this fuel line, and underneath there's one, and on the top there's one. The later ones have a different clip. So you want to get your fingers on it, push both of them, and you push the connector, the fuel line in towards the injector. This is your fuel injector right here. Take extra care not to damage that connector. This still has a factory clip. And push in and then pull off. So, you know, there is a special tool for it, but I don't need to show that. So you see how it released it from that little rib right there? And then carefully pull it off. And you might get a dribble, but if the fuel pump was working, it should have been gushing out. So we're going to turn the key on. I hear the fuel pump relay click, and so that's a good thing, and I'll show you what that is, but there's definitely no fuel gushing out of that fuel line. So let's make sure the fuel pump is getting electricity next, and the relay is functioning. Underneath, this is on your left side. This is your fuel pump relay. This is 2 fuses, one for the fuel pump and ignition system, and the injector is this 10 amp fuse. This 3 amp fuse is the ECU power. The immobilizer light would not flash if this fuse was out, and it won't start. This keeps power to the computer or the throttle body, or whatever you want to call it, when the ignition's off, because it stores like kind of some running, adjustable running values that it wants to keep in memory. So that's why there's a very low amp fuse. So this is going to have power at all times. You could check the fuses just like we checked the fuses in the glove box on part 1. And typically you want to ground, you can ground a throttle body. This fuse should have power all the time. Now I got the wires going, so we're good here. We probably wouldn't even get cranking here. This one's going to have power all the time as well, but it's switched by this relay. The next thing is this relay. I know it's coming on. When I turn the ignition on, you put your thumb on it, you can feel the click, and you can kind of listen for the click. So it has that initial prime sequence where it just comes on for just about a second. That means the relay is getting energy from the computer. The computer's telling it to come on. And obviously when the scooter starts, the relay stays on because you keep the fuel pump going. Next, so we know the fuel pump fuse is good. The relay would still click if this fuse was blown, FYI, but you would not get spark, and you would not get fuel pressure if that fuse, 10 amp fuse, was blown. So let's move kind of towards the front inner part of this electrical. This was not the best setup. The later GTS 300s, this was vastly improved upon. These connectors were prone to burning up if they ever got oxide on them. This connector is actually loose. It should be on that clip. We're going to fix that. Now this bracket that kind of holds it is kind of just not as tidy as the later bikes. There's one more hidden fuse block. So you got a total of 3 different fuse blocks on these GTS 250s. This one just kind of slides out of that mount. And these are 2 main, the main fuse is this 30 amp fuse. The scooter would not charge the battery if this fuse was blowing. And then you have this is another ECU fuse. I think this is the power for the ECU, which is a 7.5. So when the ignition gets turned on by this orange wire, it powers the computer. So if that one's blowing, you're not going to get ignition as well. So pretty much all the ignition related fuses, with the exception of the brake light fuse, are all underneath here. So you need all these fuses to be here for the engine to run. So just kind of keep that in mind. You want to check all those fuses. We know they're good. But the reason I'm pulling this bracket up is I want to fix this connector, kind of show you how we'd fix that anyways. I know it's kind of typically what you want to do. You want to fix all the problems. You don't want to leave like a mess, start breaking stuff. And there's a reason that connector had a tab that holds it in place. But also the reason I'm pulling this away is I want to gain access to the fuel pump connector. The later models, they did away with this connector. It's actually a 4-pin connector on the fuel pump. These 250s, it was kind of like a little extension cord connector. Kind of makes it a little nicer to work with. You could slide the connector right out of these little tabs here. That's why I loosened this bracket, because it's really hard to get the connectors on this. And there's a pair of wires for a fuel gauge and a pair of wires for the fuel pump itself. So you go ahead and lift that tab on that seal connector, and that reveals the fuel pump wiring. And if I recall, I think the black with the green wire should see that at the relay as well. That's the wire that should energize when you turn the key on. So we're going to check for 12 volt power to the fuel pump at this connector. So I'm just pulling this little clip out because then I can easily access the contacts. Don't lose that little retainer. Just makes it a little easier. So it's going to be kind of a difficult task. So I got green. I think that's got the green stripe. Doesn't really matter. And I'm going to see if I could hold these. And you can watch the meter while I try to be ventriloquist here and hold these wires, and I'm going to turn ignition on. So you might have somebody help you do this, but let's just see if the fuel pump gets power when we power up the key. Yep. Then it goes back to 0. So, or a very low value. So I saw the 12 volts come online right when the relay was energized, you know, the fuel pump relay. So we're pretty certain the fuel pump's getting power, but it's not spinning up. And that's typically what you'd find with a scooter that's been sitting for several years. The fuel pump will either end up with oxidized contacts because they are a brushed motor in there, and they just will no longer get powered. Or another thing I've seen is they'll blow the main fuse, you put another fuse, they blow it again. The fuel pump rotor is actually stuck, physically jammed up with gummy fuel, and it just can't spin up to make power. One other test you could do here is, this is your fuel level sender. If it was disconnected, I should see the 2 bars, the top level bar and the empty bar flash on the bar graph fuel gauge. It's not that way if you have an analog fuel gauge, but that's like just telling you that your fuel sender is open. And sometimes I've had scooters that have been sitting for all these years, they end up needing a fuel sender as well. The fuel sender will not work correctly. So the way you want to get all these connectors back onto this plate so they're all secure before you button this up. The nice thing is you can disconnect all these connectors. That's how you pull the motor out. That's the reason you have access. But these things, they're just really difficult to get, to slide them in when, there you go. So there's only one direction they go. I think it's been a while since I've even done this here. There we go, and it should click. There we go, so that one's in place. This one, so we'll get all these snapped in place. This is kind of not really the best setup. Like I said, on the later ones, they're just much tighter with the wiring, have far fewer electrical issues because they've cleaned up everything so much better on them. And we'll get that last connector, which is this one. And they'll all be on this plate, and then we'll be able to put the plate back in place. But pretty much our next step, I'm kind of at the end of the road for this video. I've covered on another red GTS how to remove the fuel tank, and that's pretty much what you need to do to get access to the fuel pump. That's your next step. So I've showed in the past how to remove it. There's going to be pretty much remove the taillight, the turn signals, lenses. You have 3 screws that hold the fuel tank in place. You're going to want to drop the shocks. The reason being is so you could drop the engine partly, so you can pull the fuel tank down. And that's how you go about changing the fuel pump. And I'll cover on one last issue. You may have heard of the Vespa GTS fuel pump recall. You can still look up the VIN number and see if the scooter qualifies. If it's an older GTS like this, a 2006 to 2007 GTS 250, these have a fuel pump that was supplied by a European company, and they never seem to have any problems unless you let the scooter sit like this one. They oftentimes will last the life of the scooter, no problems, as long as they're not left to rot away. I think it was at very tail end of 2008 when the 2009 models came out, they started sourcing a fuel pump out of China. And those fuel pumps is what would happen. They would get on a hot day. If you run into scooter on a very hot day, the clearance on the impeller rotor of the fuel pump was too, machined too tight. So it's like inside a fuel pump, it's just the impeller that makes the pressure for the fuel. It was machined too tight. So on a very hot day, the fuel pump could physically stall. Sometimes it would blow this fuse. Well, if the fuel pump stalls, you cause your motor to stall because you're no longer building fuel pressure. But oftentimes, you would turn the scooter off on a warm day, the motor would heat soak into the fuel tank, bring the fuel tank up to about 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's what would trigger that fuel pump to seize up, so when you turn on the scooter, it wouldn't restart. And that pretty much affected 2009 all the way on to some of the early 2011 models. Again, you can look up the VIN. It was a National Highway Safety Board recall. So, you could certainly look that up and see if your fuel pump still qualifies for that. If it's been done and the fuel pump's jammed up, well, sorry, you could only do the recall once. The fuel pumps they replaced them with were still made in China, but they were engineered to the correct tolerances. And when you pull the fuel pump out, you'll see the top of the fuel pump is brown. And I think in the video where I changed out the fuel pump, I talked all about the different fuel pumps as well. So hope that helped you out. It's interesting. Thanks for watching. This is Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. And until next time, we'll have a new fuel pump in the scooter, and I'm certain it'll be running with fresh gas and a fuel pump, probably clean the injector out as well.